It's the Victorian England era. Selena Dawes rushes to the bedside of an older woman, Mrs. Brink. Mrs. Brink appears to be very ill from the anguish she wears on her face. Selena reaches out to touch Mrs. Brink, perhaps hoping to provide comfort. The touch seems to draw Mrs. Brink's focus to her visitor. What follows next is a harrowing scream. Before Selena can understand what's happening, she's pulled away from Mrs. Brink. After the opening credits, Margaret's household comes into view. Her mother insists she must be religious with her which were prescribed to help her mental state after her father's passing. She hates the way the medication makes her feel. Her thoughts get foggy and her dreams get distorted. She's not even sure why everyone is in such a frenzy about her well-being. She's only trying to live her life. She recalls how her father would always say, "The only cure for sorrow is work." To cope with her grief, she's enrolled as a visitor at Milbank prison. She hopes her new activity will improve her state of mind. She's been feeling an unexplained pull to the work, even before it started. On her first day of the job, she meets Mr. Shillito, who is familiar with both her and her father. He reasons she must have been quite idle after her father's passing to want to take up such a job. Margaret disagrees. This, she believes, is her taking the reins to a project of her own. Mr. Shillito will be her guide. He tells her he can feel her father's approval over this project, but Margaret is indifferent. Mr. Shillito leads Margaret to Ms. Haxby. It's at this moment a bell resonates through the prison's gray walls. Ms. Haxby pulls out her pocket watch. It seems Margaret has coincidentally arrived just in time for an event. Mr. Shillito leads her to the tower window, big enough for two people to peer out at once. Prisoners form spiral circles. There was first a single prisoner. The others came in their numbers, like they were beckoned to the formation. There are 270 women in total, Ms. Haxby announces. For Mr. Shillito, that's 270 souls to be reckoned with for salvation. Ms. Haxby questions if Margaret actually thinks she can do some good in the prison. Margaret can only hope so. At best, she could be a listening ear to the prisoners. Ms. Haxby advises she knows best what to do with her time with the prisoners, but Margaret should still be vigilant about her transactions and possessions. Milbank prison is home to some expert thieves. What's most important is that Margaret is careful just how much she decides to relate with the prisoners. The prisoners are bound to misuse her generosity, Ms. Haxby warns. If Margaret didn't feel uneasy before, the feelings changed now. Ms. Haxby leads the way this time. She has a large ring of keys that jiggle with each hasty step. Margaret notes how they move through several corridors she hasn't had time to register or remember. She's bound to get lost at this pace. Ms. Haxby abruptly halts her hurried pace through the corridors of the prison. She selects a door and gestures for Margaret to enter first. Margaret's eyes hover over the narrow mattress in one corner and the iron bucket in another corner that serves a rudimentary toilet. Ms. Haxby closes the door shut behind them. It's a sound that reverberates the bare stone walls of the prison cell. It makes Margaret cringe and throw a look towards the shut door. Her eyes focus on the grill, seemingly the only sort of opening in this cramped space. She asks that the door be opened and hurriedly lets herself out. A bell rings, and a matron at the opposite end of the dimly lit corridor opens a gate. Prisoners file in. Ms. Haxby singles out one prisoner whose name is Sarah Pilling, and introduces her to their new lady visitor, Margaret Pryor. Sarah mentions she's in prison for thievery, and when Margaret asks how she's coping, she replies with an air of resilience. Ms. Haxby condenses Sarah's response to, "She's used to it." She proceeds how Sarah will be out and in again for the same crime, because so is the circle of their lives. Ms. Haxby reminds Margaret of her advice. She is not to get too close or attached to the prisoners of the ward. In her opinion, the prisoners are no better than animals. She gives her verdict as she hastens up the stairs, leaving Margaret to pant after her. Margaret asks if Ms. Haxby's verdict goes for every single prisoner. They surely all can't be hardened criminals. Ms. Haxby, in response, leads her to a new hallway she states holds better and behaved women. Ms. Haxby stops to speak to another matron, Ms. Ridley. Margaret uses the distraction to wander to a nearby cell. The name on the board next to the room is Selena. Margaret opens the grill subtly and feeds her curious eyes. She doesn't find an animal behind the prison walls like Haxby is accustomed to describe them. In there is a woman oblivious to her gaze, fondling a flower. When Margaret and Ms. Haxby resume their endless walk down dark corridors, Margaret inquires whether there are any flowers in Milbank prison. Ms. Haxby informs her that flowers are forbidden in the vicinity. If Margaret was thinking of bringing any during her visits, she knows now it's best not to. Margaret inquires about the prisoner she peeped back in Block C. She recalls her last name, Dawes. Ms. Haxby knows her. She calls Selena a strange one that keeps to herself. She never receives letters or visitors. The other prisoners are afraid of her. She's rumored to be a spirit medium. Selena's story piques Margaret's interest, and she announces she'd like to visit the prisoner. She's led back to Ms. Dawes' cell. Selena is needing a soldier's stocking and pays her visitor no proper mind. Selena is not as responsive or as respectful to Margaret as Ms. Pilling from earlier. The more Margaret pushes for a conversation, the more aggressive Selena gets. She is of the opinion people like Margaret visit prisons to elevate themselves about their own lives. Margaret isn't pleased with Selena's tone and threatens to report her to Ms. Haxby. Selena confidently replies that her observations aren't insolence, but facts. Margaret decides not to report Selena to the matrons as she takes her leave. Selena, true to the rumors, now alone, starts to hear whispers and see floating faces. At dinner, Theophilus gushes about looking forward to picking up the late Mr. Pryor's unfinished work. The goal is to have Margaret as a partner on the pending project. Her father was a notable historian. Margaret confidently expresses her desire to do otherwise. She did her part when her father was alive, but his passing frees her to venture elsewhere. Mrs. Pryor scolds her callous talk, but Margaret doesn't flinch. Her sister-in-law encourages Margaret to give a download on her lady visitor activities. Margaret remembers Mr. Shillitoe's anticipation for her to reshape the prisoners. Margaret, however, chooses not to be so naive. Her goal is to learn more about life through the eyes of the prisoners. Margaret's brother doesn't see why Margaret has chosen the prison to reach her goal. When dinner is over, Theophilus reminds Margaret of his proposal. Margaret's confidence from earlier has waned, and she appears visibly tense. She tells Theophilus she will think about the proposal, but would rather not be pressured. Theophilus concedes, expressing he's willing to give her space. The conversation initially seems to revolve around their potential partnership regarding Mr. Pryor's unfinished project. However, Theophilus leans close and alludes to their pending marriage. On Margaret's next visit to the prison, something eventful happens. A batch of new prisoners arrive. Margaret watches helplessly as humanity is stripped away from the prisoners, in the form of confiscated clothes and chopped haircuts. Maybe one moment that stings Margaret the most is when a prisoner pleads with her to intervene, to save her. The unpleasantness is still with Margaret when she visits Selena's cell. Margaret's outburst of how Selena could cope is met with an answer. She has spirit friends that keep her company. Sometimes they bring her flowers. Margaret settles on the vacant bench, willingly to learn more. Selena is a lot more receptive to Margaret's presence this time and opens up. She's had her abilities since she was young. The spirits comforted her when she lost her mother by bringing messages from the grave. As time passed, she sought to help other grieving people. Her reward for good was a reputation as a medium people would later estrange. Selena shows her spirit isn't dampened by offering to be a medium for Margaret. She insists she can help Margaret navigate through the sorrow and darkness that emanates from her. But to do so, Margaret would need to open up to her. Margaret starts with her place of residence in Chelsea. She resides with her mother. Her father passed away 7 months ago. She has a brother who's married. His wife was once Margaret's closest friend. Her father was a scholar, and she was his partner. She recalls her traveling days, which are now far behind her. Selena thanks Margaret for confiding in her. She must be excited to have someone to have a proper conversation with, because she begins prancing about. It should be sad how she admits no one's called her by her first name in a long time, not since was a little girl. She, however, passes this piece of herself to Margaret with plenty of energy. Mrs. Jelf, a matron who has been assigned to the block, signaling Margaret's visiting hour is over. Selena eagerly wants to know if she'll be back. Margaret promises she will. During dinner time at the prison cafeteria, Selena is pulled to warmer times. At the prison, she's alone with her meal, but once upon a time she dined at the Vincey's Spiritual Hotel with Miss Sibry and Mr. Court. One day a lady came to sought her. She claims she had a dream about Selena in particular, and employed resources to find her. When Margaret and Selena reunite, Margaret inquires how prison became her fate. Selena narrates a medium exercise gone terribly wrong. The sitter was a young girl who got possessed, because Selena lost the reins on a spirit who was initially supposed to help. The girl eventually passed, and Selena was painted as a murderer. Margaret's skepticism oozes out, but Selena is determined to show there's depth to what she can't understand. She sits next to Margaret and tries to allure Margaret's stubborn mind. She closely whispers how they are alike. Margaret returns home and finds Helen with her baby. The baby doesn't take well to Margaret when she lifts him, and Helen proposes it will become second nature when she has children of her own. The pair were once close. For Helen to know better about Margaret's aspirations, they don't involve marriage or bearing children. Helen tries to reason with Margaret, but all Margaret can see is someone who settled for less, a fate she doesn't want. It doesn't stop Margaret from wishing she could reach Helen, probably tell her about Selena. It doesn't stop Margaret's mind from traveling to a time when Helen wasn't so scared to live her truth with her. Curiosity leads Margaret to the British National Association of Spiritualists. The keeper shows a collection of antiques. One of these antiques is claimed to have been made by an infant spirit. Attached to the ornament is a note with a name Margaret has heard before: Peter Quick. He's the spirit behind Selena's imprisonment. Once she's over the shock, Margaret asks the keeper if he knows Selena. He praises Selena for being young and gifted, then sympathizes with her unjust arrest. Margaret is looking to reopen Selena's case, but the law doesn't recognize the complexity of spiritualism. A woman overhears their conversation and testifies that Selena was indeed gifted. The woman was an attendant of many of Selena's dark circles. By the time Margaret takes her leave, she has reasons to believe Selena was honest, and her stumbling upon the association was not by chance. Theophilus runs into Margaret on her way out. He claims he's there by chance. Somehow he knows the depths of Margaret's activities in the prison. He assumes her reason for seeking a medium is to possibly bring her late father back to life. He tries to warn her away from such foolishness while eluding his love for her. Margaret tells him off, asking that he let her be. When she gets home for lunch, her mother brings up marriage. Margaret hints she doesn't see that fate. She argues that she doesn't have feelings for Theophilus. Her mother insists it will happen. She will learn to love her suitor, or at least tolerate him. Against her mother's wishes, she brings up the topic of spirits at dinner time. She has everyone engaged in the discussion, but not of Selena's innocence. Back at the prison cell, Selena is hunted by images of a woman wailing and trying to fight off and assault her. Margaret visits soon after. This time, Selena opens up about her late mother. Selena describes her as a good mother and a better companion than some of the spirits she's had. She started meditating at age 12. Her gift took her to places like Chelsea. Selena inquires why Margaret is so fascinated with her story. Perhaps Margaret needs a muse for a book. Margaret admits she does some writing, but it's just in her journal. She asks Selena to permit her to make new entries about her life in the said journal. Selena starts to feel comfortable being eclectic around Margaret. She talks about knowing Margaret's thoughts, and spirits always there to reach her. Margaret decides she's had enough for the day and jolts up to leave. She mentions she's looking into Selena's case for a possible retrial. When Margaret gets home, she finds a pot of flowers. The maids claim to not know where they came from, but her mother reasons Theophilus must have sent them. In the solitude of her cell, Selena recalls when things began to turn sour. Vincy and some other occupants of the hotel were getting jealous of Selena's rising fame. Vincy's wife in particular tagged her as ungrateful and adulterous. She wanted Selena out of the house, and Selena was ready to comply. She was offered a new home with Mrs. Brink at Sydenham. Selena arrived at Mrs. Brink's grand estate. She felt like a princess in a castle. Mrs. Brink offered Selena her mother's clothing, and inquired if they could invoke her spirit later that night. It's an opportunity to see Selena in her second nature. Mrs. Brink's mother's spirit took over Selena's body and spoke to her daughter. Reconnecting with her mother caused Mrs. Brink to shiver with tears. Margaret gets to witness a prisoner get isolation for having a fit. She once again stands helplessly, taking in the harrowing scene. When it is over, she expresses disdain, but Miss Haxby waves off her emotions. Miss Haxby takes Margaret to her office to discuss her report. Her visits to the prison and a prisoner in particular have become too personal. Miss Haxby can't stop her from still visiting, but she suggests the visits are less frequent. Margaret lets Selena know of the situation, but promises to persevere. At home, strange things are still happening. Margaret can't find the locket she stashed in her drawer. She questions the maids, who have no knowledge of where it could be. Her mother doesn't understand why she's getting worked up about a locket. It's not so much the locket, but what it contains. A lock of Helen's hair, given as a gift to Margaret at a time Helen could still love her freely. Meanwhile, Selena recalls further days at Mrs. Brink's. The older woman suggested she consider materialism in other forms. Selena looked into it, and in the process her guide revealed himself to her. Selena then asked Mrs. Brink to bring a number of friends to engage in a dark circle. Mrs. Brink and her friends bore witness to Selena's manifestation of her spirit guide. His pale face flickered in the dark, so it appeared like he was a floating head. He revealed his name as Peter Quick. The audience got to see Selena's control speak through her mouth, even while materialized. The show was cut short when Peter was drawn away by someone, or something else. The exercise exhausted Selena, but Mrs. Brink was there to anchor her. Before Margaret's next visit to Milbank, she thinks hard about Selena. The prisoner with the compelling energy that Margaret feels is strong enough to draw her in. She decides she must be more careful. On Margaret's next visit, Mrs. Jelf tells Margaret the prison's schedule doesn't involve visiting hours that day. The matron, however, offers to be her tour guide over other aspects of the prison. Margaret is shown the own room. It's a room with a large cabinet. White chalk assigns each prisoner by name to a drawer. Margaret thinks it's invading the prisoner's privacy when she's offered to take a look inside one of the drawers. Mrs. Jelf shows it's fine and asks her if there's a prisoner in particular whose belongings she'd like to see. Margaret spots Selena's drawer on the higher parts of the cabinet. She feigns dizziness to get the matron to leave and get her some water and smelling salts. Curiosity gets the best of Margaret, and she checks out Selena's belongings for the brief moment she's alone. The feel of Selena's hair and the scent from her clothes comforts Margaret. She's careful enough to return the ladder used for reaching higher drawers back to its original spot. But she fails to properly tuck in Selena's hair. When the visit is over, she considers whether she's been lured into a trap by Mrs. Jelf. The matrons might be working hard to prove she's going too far. Margaret has a restless night, with images of prison life haunting her sleep. Selena is also in her dreams. When she wakes at morning light, she finds Selena's cut hair by her pillow. It's frightening, because it should be in Selena's drawer back at the prison. She tucks it under her pillow when her mother briefly walks in to draw open the curtains. After her mother leaves, she knows she's not hallucinating when she finds Selena's hair still under her pillow. Margaret's next visit is with urgency. She confirms Selena is the one who sent the flowers and her locks of hair. Selena is slowly beginning to break Margaret's tough walls, both mentally and physically. Margaret is still trying to fight, pulling away from Selena each time she draws close. Selena lets her know she could make an escape through the help of her spirits if she chose to. But the right time matters, and the right time is Margaret. Their breath-hitching conversation is interrupted by a group of matrons filing in. Miss Haxby announces Selena will be transferred to another prison on the merits of good conduct. The matron details that the services at the new prison are more humane. Selena doesn't want to leave, but Miss Haxby firmly states it's not her decision to make. Selena, fueled by rage, throws a piece of furniture at Miss Haxby. It hits her just above an eye. At dinner time, a troubled Margaret reveals Selena has been placed in solitary confinement under harsh conditions that could involve chains and hobbles. The more she reveals, the more overwhelmed she feels to still remain at dinner. She wants instead to be at Selena's side, and blames herself for Selena's current harsh conditions. She rushes to her room, swept in tears. Helen is asked by her husband to check on Margaret, but Theophilus opts to take the role. He claims to know what has Margaret so distressed. Mr. Shillito is present at the dinner table, and claims responsibility for giving Margaret access to the prison life in the first place. Clearly the environment is taking its toll on her. Theophilus finds Margaret in her room, weeping. He still thinks Margaret's struggles are with the loss of her father. Still under the impression that Margaret's closeness with the medium is to resurrect her father, he insists she must move on from the love of her father and focus on newer prospects. He gets physically close, enough to try and impose some of those newer prospects. Margaret begs him to stop, admitting her heart is with someone else. He doesn't react to her admission. Margaret uses both her body and voice to try and fight off Theophilus's possible assault. She cries out for one of the maids, who indeed comes to the rescue. Theophilus is forced to peel himself off a traumatized Margaret and take his leave. The maid, Vigor, is assured that's the last they'll see of Theophilus. Selena is shown in solitary confinement, beaten and gagged. Once upon a time, she was restrained under different conditions. Part of her spectacles during one of her many dark circles, she encountered a young woman named Agnes, whom Peter Quick took an interest in. After the initial audience cleared, Selena was with Agnes. It seems Agnes accepted Peter's offer to be used as his vessel, and Selena was tasked with helping Agnes reach that goal. They had a room to themselves and Peter appeared, demanding the happenings behind closed doors stay closed. The events of what happened next alludes to a mental darkness, much like the physical darkness Selena has now been confined to. Miss Haxby allows Margaret to visit Selena in solitary confinement, but warns Margaret's actions are fully hers to take responsibility for. Selena reveals she hit Miss Haxby, so her good credits will be written off. She's grown too attached to Margaret to be separated from her. She talks again about escape from prison, possible through the help of the spirits. In Margaret, she's found her affinity. This she says to Margaret in hushed, urgent words, holding her hands. Selena knows of Margaret's past with Helen, and swears with her, it will be different. The spirits have told her all she needs to know about her soulmate, and now it's left for Margaret to agree they run away and live their truth. But Margaret isn't brave enough, not yet. She ultimately makes her way to Selena's cell. She tells Selena she'll fall through with the plans to escape. She acknowledges she's fallen in love with Selena. Margaret consults her brother, Stephen, about her assets assigned from her father's will. It's a whole lot of money, but Stephen or her mother will need to co-sign a release. He asks his sister her reasons, and she vaguely responds about a trip abroad, maybe with or without someone. Stephen hesitates to co-sign. He pleads with his sister to give him more time to think about it. In that time, she should think too. If she still feels as the same, he'll grant her wish. Margaret doesn't have time to think. She pulls a distraction and steals a bank order from Stephen's table. At home, her mother isn't happy Theophilus has called off his engagement with the Pryor family. Margaret's defense is that she wasn't interested in him in the first place. Mrs. Pryor is ready to give up, accepting a spinster life for her daughter. In that case, she announces they'll leave on Monday to go stay with Margaret's aunt in Warwickshire. Margaret has another defiant moment, and her mother leaves for Warwickshire without her. Margaret can only think her good luck has come through the help of the spirits. In her alone time, she's able to forge Stephen's signature on the bank order she stole. Luck remains on her side during the visit to the bank, and it seems she'll be granted access to her assets. Next up on her activity list is a visit to Bone Street. In this rare moment, Margaret is smiling as she buys clothes for Selena, preparing for their lives together. When Margaret is reunited with Selena for a visit, she chimes in about her preparations. Passports, clothes, money, the boat for escape. Margaret is to wait for Selena to do her part. Margaret must keep a candle burning through the night, on the day Selena will come to her. Selena describes she'll come in like a shivering wind that causes goosebumps on the arms. A matron announces lights out. Margaret and Selena have less than 5 minutes to the end of the visit. Selena strips down to her undergarments on Margaret's command, and Margaret moves in for their first kiss, drinking her in. Margaret retires for the night. She instructs Viger, her maid, to come to her aid should she get frightened during the course of the night. The clock ticks. Time gravitates towards midnight in expectation of her newfound lover. She lights a candle just as Selena has instructed. She keeps Selena's hair close for comfort. Time passes, and there's no show of Selena except in Margaret's dreams. When she awakens, the day has dawned. She refuses to be disappointed, but understands Selena must have tried. She hurries to the prison and discovers Selena escaped, although none of the matrons or guards are sure when. There's nothing out of place in the wake of her escape. She might as well have disappeared into thin air. Miss Haxby lets Margaret know the law won't go easy on her, should it be she is housing a fugitive. Margaret leaves, speechless and confused. She reaches home and finds a woman by her door entrance, but it's not Selena. Margaret shows the woman in, but is too preoccupied about Selena's whereabouts to ask for a proper introduction. On a closer look, it's Mrs. Jelf. Margaret reasons Selena must have had some sort of help in escape. It takes seconds for her to realize she's sharing the same room with someone who also cared for Selena. Mrs. Jelf admits she was the one who helped Selena escape. Selena had been a mediator between her and her son. She even has a locket with a lock of her son's hair, to prove he was communicating through her. Margaret takes one look at the locket and knows it didn't descend from heaven above. It's her missing locket with Helen's hair. Margaret realizes she's been played. So has Mrs. Jelf. She disguised Selena as a fellow matron so she could escape. Mrs. Jelf believes Selena is long gone with Viger. Viger was Selena's maid long before she was Margaret's. Both crooks sent each other messages through the matron. It becomes clear how Margaret received the orange blossoms and Selena's hair. It explains how her locket went missing. It may also explain why Mrs. Jelf was exceptionally kind towards Margaret. The matron explains she was of the impression that Margaret knew Selena's relationship with Viger. Margaret's room has been ransacked, and all the things she prepared for her and Selena's escape are gone. Selena has even left a note asking she be forgiven, blaming her action on her control, Peter Quick. But there is no Peter Quick. A young woman named Madeline was brought to Mrs. Brink's home to seek Selena's service. During the initiation stage, Madeline wanted out, feeling bad vibes from the process. Peter Quick wasn't having it, and wanted to force the girl through the process. She fought back, screaming, crying, and drawing Mrs. Brink's attention. The mask had fallen off, revealing Quick as Ruth Viger. The revelation gave Mrs. Brink a cardiac arrest. In the aftermath, Margaret burns what traces are left of Selena in her home. Her affinity must be somewhere across the sea, to Rome or Peru. Who knows? Margaret, too, longs to be with the waters, so she goes to the bridge and leaps.